At least your sister had the sense to marry someone who could actually provide for a family. My mother said it the way she always said things like that. Not loudly, not cruelly, just matter-of-factly, the way you'd comment on the weather. She was standing at the kitchen island, refilling her wine glass, and she said it to my aunt, not even to me directly. Just loud enough that I could hear it from the living room. Loud enough that my brother-in-law, who was sitting 3 feet away from me on the sectional, suddenly became very interested in his phone. 22 people at my parents' house that Thanksgiving. Extended family from Sudbury, my sister's in-laws up from Windsor, a few neighbors my mother had started inviting because she liked the audience. I was 41 years old, holding a plate of cranberry sauce I'd driven 4 hours to bring because my mother had specifically asked me to, and I had just been described as someone who lacked the sense to make good choices. I didn't put the plate down, didn't say a word. I walked to the buffet table, set the cranberry sauce next to the turkey, and looked across the room at my nephew, who was 7 and completely absorbed in a stuffed hockey player he'd gotten for his birthday. I focused on that. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. My mother moved back toward the dining room. She touched my sister's shoulder as she passed her, the small habitual gesture she'd been making my entire life. There was a retired judge at that dinner, my uncle's old colleague, a man named Bernard who'd driven down from Barrie, and who I had met exactly twice before. He was standing near the fireplace with a glass of Scotch, watching. He said nothing then, but I noticed that he set his glass down. Before I tell you what Bernard did next, and why a man who had spent 30 years on the Ontario Superior Court of Justice was the one who finally said out loud what no one in my family had ever bothered to say, you need to understand what my mother meant when she said I lacked sense. Because she didn't mean I was careless. She meant I was inconvenient. I'm a trauma surgeon. I have been for 11 years. I completed my residency at a hospital in Halifax, did a fellowship in Toronto, and have worked out of a Level 1 trauma center in Vancouver for the past 8 years. I am on call an average of 14 nights a month. I have operated on car accident victims at 2 in the morning in clothes I didn't have time to change out of. I have had to tell families in waiting rooms things no one should ever have to say. My mother knew all of this. She just didn't find it impressive. What she found impressive was my sister Ingrid's house in Oakville, the one with the mudroom and the double garage, and the correctly proportioned backyard for a neighborhood with a good school district. Ingrid had married a corporate lawyer named Fletcher at 28. She had 2 children, a labradoodle, and a kitchen renovation that my mother had helped her pick the countertops for. This was the life my mother understood. This was legible to her. This made sense. I was not legible to my mother. I had moved away at 18 to go to university and never returned in the way she expected returning to look like. I didn't come home for every holiday. I missed Ingrid's engagement party because I was mid-rotation and couldn't get the weekend covered. I bought a condo in Kitsilano that my mother had visited once and described as small, even though she'd never been to Vancouver before and had nothing to compare it to. I was 41 and not married, which she mentioned every single time we spoke, without exception, the way other people mention the weather. I had long since stopped expecting her to ask about my work. The last time she'd asked anything specific about my job was 7 years ago, when she wanted to know if I could get her a referral to a dermatologist. Not a question about what I did, what it cost me, what I was proud of. A transaction. The sharpest memory I have is from my 2nd year of residency. I had just come off a 30-hour shift. I'd lost a patient that morning, a 23-year-old who'd come in after a highway collision, who I had worked on for 4 hours and still couldn't bring back. I called my mother from a payphone in the hospital lobby because my cell battery was dead and I needed to hear a voice I recognized. She listened. I told her about the shift, about the patient, about sitting in the locker room afterward with my hands still shaking. I told her I wasn't sure I was built for this, that the distance between knowing what to do and being able to do it fast enough was something I thought about every single day. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, Ingrid just got promoted, regional manager, 32 years old." She said it gently, almost proudly. The way a person says something they think is encouraging. I held the phone against my ear and looked at the linoleum floor of that hospital lobby and understood something I had been slowly understanding for years. This was not a conversation between a mother and a daughter. It was a transaction in which I was the lesser asset. I thanked her for picking up and hung up. That was the last time I cried on a payphone. The last time I expected her voice to be what I needed it to be. That Thanksgiving, back in the living room with the cranberry sauce and the stuffed hockey player and 22 people who were all doing the careful, choreographed thing that families do when they don't want to acknowledge a thing that just happened. Bernard set down his glass. He crossed the room slowly. He was 71, with the deliberate movement of a man who had learned that pace communicated authority. He stopped beside the buffet table, picked up a serving spoon he didn't need, and said quietly, "You're the one who works at Vancouver General?" I said yes. He said, "Level 1?" I said yes. He nodded, the way a person nods when they're confirming something they already suspected. Then he said, still quietly, not turning toward the room, "Do you know what the acceptance rate is for trauma surgery fellowships in this country?" I told him I did. He said, "I thought so." He set down the serving spoon. He turned to face the dining room, where my mother was directing people to their seats with the cheerful efficiency she reserved for occasions where she was performing warmth. He said, in a voice that was suddenly not quiet at all, "Helen, before we sit down, I want to say something." The room shifted the way rooms shift when a person who carries a certain kind of weight chooses to use it. My mother turned. She smiled the smile she uses when she's managing a situation. "Of course, Bernard. What's on your mind?" He said, "I'd like to know when the last time was that you asked your daughter about her work." The smile stayed in place. The rest of her face went somewhere else. He didn't wait for an answer. He said, "Because I sat on the bench for 30 years. I reviewed cases, I read expert testimony, I worked alongside some of the finest physicians in this province, and I want you to understand something about the person standing next to your cranberry sauce. Trauma surgeons at Level 1 centers are not a common thing. They are not produced easily or quickly or without cost. The acceptance rate for the program she completed is under 4%. The survival outcomes at her hospital are among the highest in British Columbia. I know this because I follow these things. I've followed them for years. And I have been standing in this room for 2 hours listening to you describe your daughter as someone who lacks sense. And I need you to know that I find that extraordinary." My mother opened her mouth. He hadn't finished. He said, "I'm not telling you to be proud of her because I think you should perform pride for my benefit. I'm telling you because I think you have not looked at this person." He gestured toward me without drama, just a slight incline of his hand, and understood who she is. And that strikes me as the thing in this room that most lacks sense. 22 people. Not one of them made a sound. My sister had her fork in her hand, and she didn't put it down, but she also didn't move. My brother-in-law was looking at the wall. My aunt from Sudbury had the particular expression of someone who is relieved that a thing is happening that they cannot be blamed for. My mother recovered the way she always recovered. Composure first, explanation second. She laughed, not a real laugh, a social management laugh, and said, "Bernard, I think you may have misheard. I was just saying that the girls made different choices, and that's wonderful." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look I'd seen described in court transcripts, the look that precedes a ruling. He said, "I didn't mishear anything." He picked up his scotch. He sat down at the far end of the table. I was reading the room on instinct. My mother was waiting for me to say something that would let her reframe what had just happened. If I cried, I was too sensitive. If I argued, I was creating a scene. If I thanked Bernard, I was weaponizing a guest. I had watched her run this script for 41 years. I knew every exit. I said nothing. I sat down at the table. I put food on my plate. My sister appeared at my elbow 3 minutes later, voice low and carefully neutral, the voice she uses when she's decided something needs to be managed. She said, "Are you okay? You seem tense. This is supposed to be a nice dinner." The sentence was engineered. The concern was real in the way that Ingrid's concern was always real, but it was concern for the table, not for me. She wanted the dinner to proceed. She needed the tension to dissolve so that the event could be remembered as a good one, not because she was cruel. Because the alternative, acknowledging that something had been wrong for a very long time, would require her to re-examine her own position in this family, and that was a cost she had never been willing to pay. I looked at her. I said, "I'm fine." She gave me the nod that means she's chosen to believe that because it's convenient. She went back to her seat. My nephew climbed into the chair next to me and asked if I wanted to hear about his hockey player's name. I said yes. He told me the hockey player's name was Rocket and that Rocket had been in a lot of fights but was actually a good guy. I said that tracked. He thought about it and agreed. I ate my dinner. I did not make eye contact with my mother. I listened to Bernard talk about a canoe trip he'd taken in Algonquin Park, and I thought about the fact that I had been in a room with a person who had kept track, who had paid attention, who knew the percentage. My mother had never asked me what the percentage was. She had never asked me what I did on the nights when I lost someone. She had never asked how I managed the drive home after a bad shift, whether I had people around me in Vancouver, whether the work felt the way I thought it would when I started. For 20 years, she had access to her daughter's entire life, and she had not a single question that required me to answer honestly. I knew about Ingrid's kitchen renovation. I knew about Fletcher's firm's new downtown office. I knew about the Labradoodle's name, which was Biscuit, and the school district and the countertops and the summer camp my nephew was going to attend. I knew all of it because my mother updated me on all of it, consistently, enthusiastically, as a way of showing me what a life worth celebrating looked like. After dinner, when people were moving toward the living room and the routine redistribution of dessert and conversation, I put my coat on. My mother appeared from the kitchen with a container of leftover turkey she had portioned out in a Ziploc bag. For the drive back, she said. Her voice was different, smaller. The sharp efficiency she used to move people through rooms had gone somewhere. I looked at the bag. She made it every year for both of us. But this was the first time she had ever seemed uncertain about whether I would take it. I took it because it was turkey and I had a 4-hour drive, and there was no reason not to. I said, thanks. She said, Bernard he means well, but he can be a bit much sometimes. I said he was accurate. She looked at me. She started to say something about how she had always been proud of me, that she didn't always know how to show it, that she worried sometimes I made my life too hard. All of which was probably true in some partial way, the way a lot of things are true without being useful. I said, I know you think you're proud of me. I think you're prouder of Ingrid. I think you've always known which daughter you understood and which one you didn't, and I think you made a decision a long time ago that the one you understood was the one worth celebrating. I'm not angry, I just want you to know that I noticed. Every single time. She didn't say anything. I said goodnight to my nephew, who was asleep on the sectional with Rocket tucked under his arm. I shook Bernard's hand and said it was good to see him. He held my hand a moment longer than necessary and said, don't let them make you small. I said I haven't yet. He nodded. He let go. I drove home. I had the leftover turkey on the passenger seat and the CBC on low, and the highway was mostly empty because most people had stayed wherever they were spending Thanksgiving. The sky over Georgian Bay was doing the thing it does in October, that low charcoal dark that sits right on the horizon like it's holding something down. I had been back to my parents' house for Thanksgiving every year for 20 years. I had driven that highway more times than I could count. And I realized, somewhere past Barry, that I was not angry. I had expected to be angry. After a thing like that, after 22 people, and the cranberry sauce and my sister's careful voice and my mother's management laugh, I had expected to feel the accumulated weight of it the way I usually did on that drive, like carrying a bag that gets heavier every time you pick it up. But I didn't. I felt something else, something quieter and more final. Bernard had said it. Out loud, in a room full of people who knew it was true, including my mother. The thing that had been true for 41 years had been spoken by someone she couldn't dismiss. And I realized that I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for exactly that, not for my mother to say it, because she never would, but for the thing to be out in the air where it couldn't be taken back. It was out now. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, my phone rang at 7 in the morning on a Sunday. My mother. I let it ring 3 times, then picked up. She said, I've been thinking about what you said. I waited. She said, I want to do better. I'd like to come to Vancouver, in the spring. I've never really seen where you live. I thought about the condo she'd visited once and called small. I thought about the payphone in the hospital lobby. I thought about the night I was 26 and had just lost a patient who was 3 years younger than me, and my mother's voice telling me about Ingrid's promotion. I said, I'd like that. But I need you to understand something first. She said, okay. I said, if you come here, you're coming to see my life. Not to compare it to Ingrid's, not to mention that I'm not married, not to suggest I'm missing things. You're coming to see the hospital where I work, and the seawall where I run, and the coffee place on the corner that I go to every morning before a shift. You're coming to see what I've built, and if you can't come to do that, then I'd rather wait until you can. She was quiet for a long time. She said, I can do that. I said, okay, let's try. I hung up and stood at the window of my condo looking out at the inlet. It was November, and the mountains had their first snow on them, that thin early coat that makes everything look like a pencil drawing. I didn't know if she would actually come. I didn't know if she could do the things she said she could do, if she had the range to see me as I was, rather than as the version of me that had always been insufficient. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Either way, I had said what I meant. I had not yelled it or cried it or saved it for a holiday dinner where it could be managed and absorbed and redirected. I had said it quietly, on a Sunday morning, in my own kitchen, in the city I had chosen and the life I had built, in the voice of a woman who had learned a long time ago that the truth didn't need an audience to be real. The mountains held their snow. I made coffee. I had a shift in 4 hours, and there was work to do.